Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at decision-making within the European Union. How are decisions about how to make decisions made, and what can we learn from these processes about patterns of power in this vital institution? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. International organisations have in recent decades played a vital role in world affairs. None has been more powerful than the European Union. Yet how such organisations, not least the EU, make decisions is often sharply criticised. On the one side, their need for agreement among member states is said to lead to indecision and stasis. On the other side, the inability of individual states always to get their own way is seen as violating sovereignty. Indeed, the EU itself has long struggled to balance the competing costs and benefits of decision-making by unanimity and by so-called qualified majority. Well, a new study sheds light on decision-making about how to make decisions in the European Union. It takes a deep dive into two episodes from half a century ago: the Luxembourg Compromise of 1966 and the Paris Summit of 1974. And its analysis of the impact of these events suggests a need to revisit old assumptions about how the EU functions. Well, I'm delighted to say that the authors of that study join me now. They are Dr. Jonathan Gollop, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Reading, and our very own Dr. Michal Ovadek, who is Lecturer in European Institutions, Politics and Policy here in the UCL Department of Political Science. Welcome, Jonathan and Michal, both to UCL Uncovering Politics. And let's start with a bit of background kind of context to the particular focus that we have on these decisions from all that time ago. Jonathan, in simple terms, how are decisions made within the European Union?
In simple terms, officially, you look at the treaty. The member states signed a treaty, and when they want to pass laws, they specify in the law which bit of the treaty applies. And you either have unanimous voting or you have qualified majority voting, depending on the sort of law that is being proposed. Officially, that's how it's supposed to work.
And just what is qualified majority voting?
So bigger states have more votes than small states, but not as many as you might suspect. So Belgium has fewer votes than Germany or Italy or France, but nowhere near based on the size of the countries. You would think based on the size, Germany would have 100 votes and Belgium would have 3 or 4, but it's much more equal than that. So big states have more votes than small states, but small states are really quite overrepresented in the system. That's majority voting. Unanimous voting is one country, one vote, officially.
Mm-hmm. And the qualified majority means, I guess, not just that there's all that voting, but also there's a certain threshold to pass in order for a measure to get through.
Yes, roughly 5/7 of all the combined votes is a qualified majority. Mm-hmm. So it's should be easier to adopt something under a qualified majority system than a unanimous system.
And there are various institutions within the European Union that are all involved in some way in the decision-making process. Is it that same process of making a decision that is used in each of those institutions?
No, we're talking about the final step where it's being adopted. The way things are proposed to the council, which is where the heads of the government, the foreign ministers are, is a different system. And we're focusing really on the final step when you're going to adopt a law or not adopt a law. Is it by unanimous voting or is it by majority voting at that stage?
Michal, do you want to add to that picture at all of how decisions are made?
Not too much, just maybe that there is a sort of double rule in the qualified majority system nowadays, that essentially we are looking both at a strengthened majority, so it's not just a simple majority, right? It's more than just a half of the member states that have to vote in favor in the council. And in addition to that, there's the component which Jonathan also mentioned, which has to do with the size of the member states, right? So more populous member states have more weight in the council, and it's easier for them to also block decisions. So that's I suppose the only thing that I would add there.
Mm. And Jonathan, you started your answer there by saying that officially this is what we do. We look at the treaty, which kind of sounds as if there's a further story to be told here about how things really work in practice.
The basis of our research project, and in fact, the underlying conclusion of most of the work that has been done on the European Union, the dominant view is that these formal rules, the difference between the formal rules, don't really matter in practice. That in fact, even if you had majority voting as the treaty specifying majority voting as the decision rule, in practice, everyone seems to think that it was de facto unanimity. So even though you could have majority voting, any individual state, whether big states or small states, any individual state could object and effectively slow things down or outright block things. And that's the dominant view. And we test that view, and I think we reject that view.
And I guess that view kind of feeds this idea of the EU as a rather sclerotic institution that is incapable of making decisions on anything because it's just so difficult to get this kind of agreement that is necessary in order to make a decision.
That's exactly right. There's this narrative about the EU being incapable of making decisions, especially in the 1970s. And one of the sort of motivations behind the paper is really to look into how much truth there is to these narratives. What is narrative? What is fiction? And what does sort of the cold, hard data tell us?
How unusual is the EU as an international organization in terms of the nature of its decision-making processes?
So it's in some ways very unusual, and in other ways not so unusual. So on paper, there are many organizations which are similar to the EU, many other regional international organizations in different parts of the world, in the Caribbean, in East Africa and West Africa, which share many similarities with how the EU was originally set up in the 1950s. In practice, none of these organizations have come anywhere near close to what the EU has become or how the EU functions, and the level of integration that the EU has managed to achieve for the European continent. So there's a massive discrepancy, I would say, between the practical effects of the EU and really how it works and what it managed to achieve compared to many organizations which tried to mimic that, maybe to some extent, but failed for different reasons.
I think there are also parallels at the international level. Most people will be familiar with the United Nations and the Security Council, where there is a majority voting system, except that the 5 biggest permanent members have a veto. So there's a sort of a veto system and sort of a majority voting system in the UN. Likewise, the International Monetary Fund officially has a voting system, but a lot of these organizations work by consensus. And the dominant narrative in the EU is likewise that it was all consensus. The vote really didn't really matter in the European Union. It was all consensus, just like we see in other international organizations. And our research challenges that and says the whole consensus idea is greatly overblown, and the majority rules had a much bigger effect than people seem to think.
So what's actually at stake here in this choice between different decision rules, the unanimity rule, the qualified majority rule? How does it actually make a difference to outcomes?
Right. So maybe first conceptually, the differences between whether the states are negotiating a law in the shadow of other states being able to block that law, or whether they're negotiating in the shadow of there being a possibility of taking a vote and the majority or the qualified majority prevailing. Concretely, there are different policy areas in the EU governed by different procedural rules. So, for example, nowadays, rules on taxation are still subject to unanimity, meaning that if the EU wants to regulate matters of direct taxation, for example, or something of that nature, it would require all the member states to agree to that law for that law to pass, which of course makes it really difficult because you need to obtain the agreement of all the 27 member states. In contrast, for example, rules such as regulatory rules on the internal market, they can be passed using a qualified majority, which makes it much easier to pass them, which also creates all kinds of incentives for the EU, of course, to frame laws in different, according to different policy areas so that different rules would apply. But that's a sort of separate story.
So there's one aspect here that is around simply the ease of making decisions. And I guess fairly obviously, the closer you need to be to unanimity, the harder it is to reach a decision. It sounds like there's also a story around kind of who has power, what the kind of distribution of power is under these different rules. Is that important for us to understand as well?
Well, historically, if there is a consensus, that even small states, if they wanted to, under the majority system, they could put their foot down and say, I don't agree, I'm not part of the consensus, and they would slow down or outright block laws. So it's not the case that it was just the Germans or the French or the Italians. The narrative seems to be even small states could wield this power and claim the need for consensus. It's really quite dramatic. You don't have that in any other international organization, the idea that Belgium or even Luxembourg or the Netherlands would single-handedly block a policy on agriculture, for example, that other countries, you have a majority, but it just doesn't pass. So the stakes are high, and the bigger states have more votes, but the narrative is that even the small states could block things under the consensus, which would be quite remarkable if, in fact, that's how it worked.
Okay, great. So we've got a sense of how the EU works, how decision-making works, and also why this matters, why this is, maybe feels a little bit dry in terms of voting procedures, but actually it's incredibly important for how this major institution functions. Let's move on then to the study itself. Jonathan, what are you asking in this study? What's the driving question that shapes what you're doing?
The driving question is whether states can get together at an international summit and change the way the decision rules work, but short of having an actual treaty. So you get together at a meeting and you make an announcement and you say, we're going to do things differently. We're no longer going to operate by this consensus. We're going to go back to the way it should work, majority voting, and the project investigates whether this summit effectively had any real impact on the decision-making process in the 1970s.
So we have the Treaty of Rome passed in, I'm going to embarrass myself now, 1958. Good. They're nodding, listeners. And then so you're saying that during that initial period from 1958 up to 1966, the EU is functioning along the lines of the treaty in terms of some matters being decided by unanimity, some matters being decided by qualified majority. Is that right? But then the first of the points that you focus on in the article, the Luxembourg Compromise, comes across in 1966 and changes that. Am I getting that right?
In principle, yes. It's a little bit complicated because between 1958 and 1970 almost, the EU is going through the European Economic Community, as the EU was known back then, is going through a sort of transitional period, right? So it was just set up. The procedural rules are still sort of in flux to some extent because the founders of the treaty, the member states, they envisaged that there would be, some difficulty setting everything up. So they give themselves some extra time for especially the qualified majority rules to kick into place. And so that's actually one of the issues that frames that's sort of in the background of the whole Luxembourg Compromise, and the empty chair crisis is also known, the crisis that precedes the compromise.
Tell us what the empty chair crisis is.
Absolutely. So it's in 1965, in June 1965, the French delegate, which is essentially a high diplomat of France to the EU, who sits in the council, who makes decisions on behalf of France, who votes on behalf of France, essentially decides to walk out on the orders of Charles de Gaulle, who is then the president of France. And he doesn't return for the next 6 months, effectively. And so this is why we call the empty chair crisis, because one of the chairs around the table in the council is sort of proverbially empty because the French delegate is missing, which, of course, complicates the decision-making of the EU. But the rest of the member states, they sort of buckle down and they carry on and they try to sort of weather this crisis and just hope that, this can be resolved. And it eventually is resolved in this Luxembourg Compromise of 1966.
Okay, so what does the Luxembourg Compromise do?
Depends on who you ask. That is one of the most contested things that we study. Anyone who's done any work on the European Union, the first thing you learn, lecture number 1, is that the Luxembourg Compromise, the French won. The French wanted to prevent majority voting from taking effect. Other member states weren't happy about it, but they effectively gave in and France won, and that for the next 20 years, majority voting didn't really have any effect. That's what everyone seems to think.
So I'm just getting this history right in my head, or I'm trying to at any rate. So if I understand correctly, qualified majority voting is allowed for in the treaty in 1958, but they're not really using it very much because there's this kind of transition period into that. And the Luxembourg Compromise is basically saying, no, we're not going to transition into that. We're going to apply an informal norm that says, no, we're going to maintain a standard of unanimity.
Correct. That in 1965, 1966, instead of having this explosion of qualified majority voting, we will just effectively have consensus and de facto, in practice, unanimity. And that carried on until the mid-70s, where there was a summit, and that's what we study. And that summit said, let's revise and get rid of and renounce that old agreement and go back to the way things should have worked with majority voting.
Okay, so that's the Paris Summit.
That's the Paris Summit.
Of 1974.
Yes.
Okay, just getting it all in our minds. Fantastic. So what you're trying to understand is what's the impact of each of these informal decisions upon actual decision-making processes. And I guess in my mind I'm thinking, well, that should be easy. It should be obvious what decision-making processes were used. We can see the record. We can see how many countries agreed to different decisions. But it's actually way more complicated than I imagine, I guess.
Right. So the main difficulty here is in observing the decisions. And so what it actually means when we see countries vote in favor of a decision, right? We do not really have very detailed access to the negotiations underlying the decisions on individual laws, which makes it difficult for us to ascertain exactly the kinds of dynamics and whether the countries are essentially deciding under the shadow of a veto or a shadow of a vote. And this is kind of the key difference that we're interested in, right? So
shadow of a veto means unanimity rule, i.e. every country can veto.
Exactly.
Shadow of a vote means they will actually vote on them using those qualified majority rules.
Precisely. Right? You can imagine how this would shape the negotiation dynamic significantly, because if it turns out that any one member state can actually end up blocking a decision, that's going to change how you bargain. It's going to change what kind of demands you might have in the negotiations. It's going to change what the content of the decision looks like at the end of the day. Whereas if you know that no single member state can actually block a decision, right, and that there can be a vote and you can overrule these sort of blocking minorities, really small ones, that again changes what will end up in the decision, even if in the end everyone agrees formally, right? Everyone could come together in the end and then say, oh, we all agree. It matters for the content of the decision whether one rule or the other rule applied, right? This is absolutely central to any decision-making system, really.
So what evidence are you looking at in order to ascertain that?
It's important to note that the evidence is not available in the sense that if you looked at the Parliament, the British Parliament, everyone votes and you can just see who voted for what.
Yeah.
In the 1970s and the 1960s, there is no such data. There are recollections of how often votes took place. Everyone seems to agree that actual votes were quite rare. But as anyone who's made a group decision knows, if there's the possibility of a vote, then you don't need to force the vote. Sort of like in our paper, we talk about nuclear weapons. You don't need to use nuclear weapons to have an effect of nuclear weapons. So the shadow of the vote, of the threat of the vote, is unobservable. All you can do is look at the decision-making pace, for example, what was adopted, what wasn't adopted. You know what the formal rules were, but you're not going to be able to observe the actual vote. What we're trying to get at is if there was a threat of a vote, if there was a shadow of a vote, what would we see? And if there was no effective shadow of the vote, if it was a veto, what would we see? And that's the sort of evidence that we gather.
So just say a little bit more specifically, exactly what is the evidence that allows you to differentiate?
For example, we look at the pace at which laws are adopted under different rules. And if there was a shadow of the vote, we would expect decisions are a lot easier to take under a majority system. And if in fact they are much easier to take and they get adopted much faster than under unanimity, we would count that as evidence that's consistent with a shadow of the vote and the formal rules actually working.
Okay, I see. And can we be confident that you're right in your categorizations here?
Well, we certainly hope so. I mean, I think what plays to our advantage is that we look at different types of evidence. So we look, we really have systematically gone through the archives to retrieve as much material as possible on the decision making at the time. And so we have both sort of qualitative stories, people working in the commission or in the council and the institutions at the time, talking about the events, talking about how frequent they think the qualified majority vote blockage is, how frequent the application of the Luxembourg Compromise is, whether they can use the developments, the political developments, right? So the summits, such as the summit of 1974, to their advantage. But we also look at the sort of quantitative evidence, and we compare legislation or decisions made which were really similar before the event happened and after the event happened. And so we have a certain hypothesis about the effects of that event. And so we can see whether these decisions essentially change, right, before and after, because we sort of closely track them within different policy areas as well.
Okay, so let's move on then to the findings. So the kind of general understanding that has been out there since this period among insiders in the European institutions has been that essentially the Luxembourg Compromise worked and led to a continuation of unanimity voting, and then the Paris summit didn't work in that unanimity voting continued. Yeah, listeners, they're nodding again. Your findings are rather different. What do you actually find?
We expected that this summit in the 70s, the Paris summit, we thought that it would change a lot of things. If there was this paralysis in the 1960s, and if there was great concern to speed everything up, and then there's a big public statement, let's speed things up, let's get rid of the Luxembourg Compromise, we thought, of course, this is going to work. It's more efficient. Everyone wants it. Everyone's worried about speeding things up. And we found that it had no effect at all on the speed. So superficially, this would seem to confirm what everyone has been saying about the European Union. The majority voting just never works. When in fact, what we found is majority voting worked before and after the Paris summit. So there was basically no blockage or almost no blockage to renounce. So one of the main findings is the formal rules seem to work before and after, despite what everyone believes about the European Union. That's one of the findings. Mm-hmm. And the second really fascinating thing is if the formal rules were working both before and after, why was there so much anxiety? And as you say, that the official statement by delegates at high-level officials was things aren't working, but yet they were working. At least they seem to be working, both on qualitative and quantitative evidence. Yet the heads of state felt the need for the summit, clearly. They felt the need to make this statement. They thought that things could be more efficient. And that is we have no solid answer for why they thought that.
That's exactly the question that I was just about to ask.
I think it's one of the more sort of fascinating things to keep investigating that I think comes out of our paper, which is this discord between certain kinds of narratives that take hold in societies or maybe in the public consciousness or maybe just among a group of elite officials, such as in this case, and how it's possible for these narratives to essentially diverge from the data, right, from the official record, once you actually study that record systematically. So I think that's really, so the contribution of the paper is that we look at the data systematically and we see that, actually we don't see evidence for this narrative. But it is a separate and really interesting question of how the narrative took hold in the first place. How is it possible for so many people to sort of buy into this narrative and essentially have almost fictional recollections of things that did not happen, right? That we simply do not see any archival or evidence in the data. And so I think we probably need a separate study on that topic.
I guess I'm wondering if there's some kind of strategic reason why it would be in the interests of people in the governments to argue that they're subject to greater constraint in the terms of the ability to reach decisions than they actually are. That it's quite useful sometimes if you're in power to emphasize your powerlessness, because then you can't be blamed for things, and maybe there's an element of that going on.
It would be a bold politician who came back and said, we have been outvoted, and this is a normal occurrence, or at least we could have been outvoted, so we had to make concessions. It's unlikely that politicians are going to trumpet that. But if that's the case, what's the point of having a summit with a big announcement that you're going to go back to the voting? We have no great answer for that, and that needs further research. But below the surface or below the hood of the machine, it seems that lower level diplomats, technical experts in all these various fields, they were responding to the rules the way you would expect, regardless of what higher level diplomats may have been thinking about.
And did I pick up from the paper that there's a difference depending on what kinds of decisions that you're looking at? That so there are directives, and there are, now I've forgotten all my EU terminology. It's clearly a sign
Regulations.
of regulations, and there's a third one as well.
Decisions.
Thank you very much. And the directives do show higher levels of unanimity voting, or at least shadow of the veto, to use the language that you've been describing this in. Jonathan is now shaking his head at me. Have I got this wrong?
I think you have that wrong.
Okay.
The formal rules for directives, the formal rule is quite often unanimity. So that's not a shadow of a veto. That is a formal veto. So the reason that things took a long time in the 1970s to get adopted, if you're making directives, so harmonization of vehicle standards and food standards, a lot of those things didn't get adopted in the 70s, but it had nothing to do with the Luxembourg Compromise or a consensus. It had to do with these were not subject to majority voting. They were subject to unanimity. So as you would expect, they took years and years and years to get adopted. And so directives, which maybe are the most complex or the most difficult, those were rarely, maybe 20%, 25% of the time, subject to majority voting.
But that's just not part of the stories that is relevant to why people are having this perception that is misguided.
To some extent, it is from the perspective of, of course, the existence of unanimity voting for many policy areas at a time would slow things down in general, right? So it would make the EEC or the EU seem more paralyzed. However, the story extends beyond that, right? And the story says actually, so the received narrative is about the qualified majority voting being superseded by this Luxembourg Compromise, which effectively says, everything is now subject to some form of a veto. And we sort of push back against that part of the narrative. We are not saying that the formal rules on unanimity did not apply. That's not what we're saying. They certainly did apply. And that's why we can observe this difference in the speed of adoption between decisions made under unanimity and decisions made under qualified majority.
Okay, we're coming to the end of our time, and I guess we should think a bit about why does all of this actually matter? And maybe some of our least charitable listeners could be thinking, they've been talking for the last 20 minutes about a decision made in a summit in Paris more than 50 years ago. Why should I care about that? Jonathan, why should we care?
We should care because governments collectively want to make laws, or in many cases they want to make laws. And in order to do that, they set rules. And if you want to know whether it's easy or hard to make those rules, and whether states can individually block collective decisions or not block collective decisions, you have to look at the rules and see whether the rules work. So the big picture, the big story of our research is we ask whether the rules set up by governments to get things done, whether those rules work or they don't work. And I think that has really quite dramatic implications within the EU and also for other international organizations. If you want to get stuff done and you set up rules to make it easy or easier, do they work or do they not? Are they paralyzed somehow by a form of consensus?
So you were suggesting that there's reason to think that the pattern that we see in this case is one that we should expect to generalize to other cases. So the finding that the formal rules are what mattered here rather than these informal decisions that the leaders attempted to make in subsequent meetings, that is a pattern that it is reasonable to expect on the basis of your findings to see in other cases as well.
That's right. I think it makes sense that we would expect that to happen also in other cases, because in many instances, whenever governments do seek more efficient rules to make things happen on the international stage, and we might think of many international challenges where we would expect it to happen or maybe hope to happen, right? If we can see these international cooperation problems that really are crying out for more efficient procedures to get things done. However, if it turns out that it's really easy to override these rules just a couple of years down the line using an informal agreement, that would be quite concerning. But in fact, our paper shows that maybe it is not that easy to override formal agreements using informal decisions. So for the formalists out there, this is a good story, I think.
Jonathan?
I would agree up to a point. I think that if majority voting or majority voting like rules in different organizations, if they work the way we think they work, that's good news. But there's also a possibility that this makes the European Union, the European community, a unique case. And if it's the most developed institution in the world, and it works, and it has formal rules that work this way. Maybe it is different from the UN or the IMF, which would be quite fascinating in and of itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I guess when I'm listening to you, I'm thinking in the current context of today, the rules-based international order is not feeling especially healthy, whereas you're suggesting that actually rules do matter and rules do constrain decision makers. But maybe it's that the EU is a particular kind of institution in which this kind of rule-based process is more deeply embedded, and therefore we can be learning about what are the structures that enable this kind of rule-based way of making decisions to become more consolidated.
Yes, the EU could be special in a good way, in that rules to get things done work perhaps better than they do in other international settings.
Well, this has been a very heartening conversation. Thank you so much, both of you, Jonathan and Michael. I really love it when we have these episodes, when we delve deep into a bit of history that political scientists, most of them, have long forgotten, and actually we discover valuable lessons for the present day. So it's been great. Thank you so much. We have been discussing the article Informal Procedures, Institutional Change and EU Decision-Making, Evaluating the Effects of the 1974 Paris Summit by Jonathan Golub and Michal Owodek, which is currently available for online early access in the Journal of European Public Policy. And as ever, we'll put details in the show notes for this episode. Now, I'm not sure what we have in store for you next week, as we're recording this episode a little bit earlier than usual. But to make sure you don't miss out on that future episode, whatever it may be, or indeed on any other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham and Kaiser Kang. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.